June 1, 1933, Washington, D.C., on the steps of a newspaper building on E Street. A man in a dark suit opens a folder that has been handled too many times. The edges are soft. The paper inside is stiff with official language. Bankruptcy, receivership, sale. Beside him, another man holds a clipboard. Names are written in rows. Next to each name, a figure. Each figure is an offer reduced to a clean line of ink. Each offer is supposed to be final. Behind them is a doorway that has swallowed decades of newsprint and payroll slips. Type metal ordered by the ton. Ink by the barrel. Paper by the carload. Inside, desks where editors once marked copy, with pencils worn down to the wood. In the accounting office, ledgers that know the difference between revenue and pride. A clerk reads the terms. The crowd is quiet in the way crowds become quiet when the law is doing something irreversible. The voice is steady. He is not describing a family. He is describing an asset. A number is announced. Then another. The bids are compared. The highest is accepted. In a moment, an institution changes hands without moving an inch. The building stays where it is. The presses can keep turning. The same headlines can still appear on the street. But the ownership, the control, the right to decide what the paper says and how it is paid for, moves away like a sealed envelope passed across a counter. For the McLean name, this is not merely a business event. It is a public accounting of something that has been slipping for years. Money spent faster than it can be replaced. Debts that multiply quietly. Obligations that begin as temporary bridges and end as permanent weight. Somewhere else in Washington, in a house that still looks like a statement, a receipt book sits in a drawer. A list of bills, a list of jewelers, a list of florists, a list of caterers, a list of things paid for because payment for a long time felt like proof that nothing could truly be lost. But the law has its own proof. On these steps, it is not a party that ends. It is a set of rights, a set of controls, a story that can no longer be managed by charm or by denial. The question is not whether a fortune can buy beautiful things. The question is, what happens when the bills become more durable than the beauty? Chapter 1. The Deed. 1903, DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C., 2020 Massachusetts Avenue, N.W. A mansion is not built from romance. It is built from contracts. Stone orders, lumber deliveries, wages for masons and carpenters, bills for plasterwork and ironwork, receipts for fixtures that arrive in crates and are unwrapped like evidence of arrival into a new class. Thomas Walsh has arrived in Washington with Western money, and he wants Washington to understand that the money is permanent. In 1902, he sells the Camp Bird mine for $6 million. The sum is large enough to end argument. It changes not only his balance sheet, but his address book. It makes Washington possible. The house that follows is a physical translation of that sale. By the time it is completed, it has 60 rooms, a theater, a ballroom, a grand staircase meant for photographs and for hierarchy. The residence is discussed in the city not as shelter but as a fact. One of the most expensive private houses Washington has seen. Inside, the household runs on inventory. Carpets, draperies, silver, china, a staff roster, a schedule for entertaining that must be maintained like a public service. A man from Colorado has bought his way into the Capitol, but the Capitol requires performance. It requires repetition. It requires that wealth be shown in the correct language. Evalyn Walsh is born on August 1, 1886 in Colorado, into a family that will become, within her childhood, something else entirely. The movement from mining towns to Washington parlors is not merely a change of scenery. It is a change of procedure. In the West, wealth is treated as luck and risk. In Washington, wealth is treated as an argument. You must present every week with fresh flowers, fresh linen, fresh invitations, and the quiet assurance that your money will not vanish with the next market tremor. Her father's fortune is not only money, it is architecture. It is a deed filed and recorded. It is a building so heavy it tries to make the family's legitimacy feel equally heavy. Evalyn grows up inside that weight. She learns the rhythms of elite Washington before she is old enough to choose them. She learns that a house is a machine that converts money into social permission. There are objects that mark this stage of her life. Stationery with embossed initials, calling cards, guest lists kept and revised, menus written out by hand and saved, because even food becomes a record when it is served at scale. The household depends on deliveries and on servants whose labor is designed to be invisible. In a mansion, invisibility is part of the product. The turning point comes quietly, the way major family changes often do. On April 8, 1910, Thomas Walsh dies. The house remains. The money remains. But the person who understood how the fortune was made is gone. What is left is wealth without the original discipline of risk, wealth now meant to be carried forward through marriage, inheritance, and management. And Evalyn is at the center of it, young, famous, watched. What remains today is bluntly physical. The Walsh McLean house still stands at 2020 Massachusetts Avenue, NW. It is no longer a private mansion. It serves as the embassy of Indonesia. The deed changed hands. The rooms were repurposed, but the building endures as proof that a Western mining fortune once tried to become permanent in Washington by turning money into stone. The mine also remains in another form, in the Colorado mountains, where extraction left scars and tunnels and a record of production tallied in ounces and dollars. The transformation from ore to mansion was never magic. It was logistics. It was tonnage moved, ore milled, metal sold, profit counted, then reinvested into a structure meant to impress people who had never seen the mountain that paid for it. The question is not whether a mansion can make a family look established. The question is what a family must spend year after year to keep the illusion from cracking. Chapter 2, The Marriage License. July 22, 1908, Denver, Colorado. A marriage begins as paperwork, a license, names written in full, ages, places of residence, signatures that do not capture hesitation. The state witnesses the formation of a household, the way it witnesses the transfer of property, with forms filed and recorded. Evalyn Walsh marries Edward Beale McLean, known as Ned. He is an heir to another kind of American power, publishing money and political proximity. His family's wealth is tied to a newspaper, to influence carried through ink, through editorials, through the daily ritual of telling a city what it should know and what it should fear. This is not a simple union of two people. It is a merger of two systems. On one side, a mining fortune, freshly translated into Washington architecture. On the other, an inherited institution that produces public narrative. Together they create a household that becomes a kind of stage. Washington in the early 20th century is a city built on proximity to power. Senators, cabinet officials, ambassadors, financiers, lobbyists, journalists. The lines between public duty and private appetite are thin. A house that can host the right people at the right time becomes more than a home. It becomes a tool. The McLeans understand this. Their entertaining is not occasional. It is routine. It requires staff, menus, flowers, orchestras, carriages, later automobiles. It requires that servants work long after midnight, clearing rooms that were designed to look effortless, no matter how exhausting the effort is. A family's social dominance can be measured in the most ordinary numbers. How many place settings are owned? How many chairs can be produced without renting? How many bottles are opened in a night? How many invitations are accepted? How many names can be brought together under one roof without a visible dispute? Evalyn becomes famous for this life. She is photographed. written about, admired and criticized in the same breath, because America has always loved wealth and resented it, especially when it belongs to a woman who refuses to play small. Children arrive, and with them, the added logistics of a dynasty. 4 in total: nurses, tutors, doctors, accounts that grow more complex because the household is now feeding not only parties, but a future. In these early years, money still feels like a climate. It surrounds everything. It makes consequences seem negotiable, but there are early signs of strain. A fortune that is displayed constantly must be replenished constantly. The obligations are not only financial, they are psychological. A socialite is expected to be available, luminous, unchanged by fatigue. A husband with appetites and impulses is expected to be managed without scandal. A household that draws headlines attracts creditors too, because credit follows display the way dust follows velvet. The turning point is subtle at first. It is the shift from ownership as certainty to ownership as responsibility. The more they possess, the more they must maintain. The more they maintain, the more they must spend. The more they spend, the more they must pretend the spending is not fear. What remains today is partly a geography. The Washington that hosted their life is still legible in addresses. Massachusetts avenues, great houses. Georgetown streets where old money learned to hide behind trees and stone walls. The districts built for proximity to the federal core. Buildings that were once private are now embassies, institutions, or apartments. But the map still shows what the city valued: closeness, display, permanence. And the paper remains. Marriage records, property transfers, estate documents, the legal skeleton of a life that, from a distance, can look like endless celebration. Underneath, it is still forms filed and bills paid. The question is not whether two fortunes can be joined. The question is what kind of hunger grows inside a life where everything is already supposed to be enough. Chapter 3. The Jeweler's Invoice. February 1911. Paris and Washington, connected by letters. A famous diamond does not move like ordinary property. It travels with insurance riders and locked cases. It travels with the attention of jewelers who understand that a stone has two values: what it is and what people believe about it. Pierre Cartier wants to sell the Hope diamond to the McLeans. The stone is deep blue, heavy, measured precisely at 45-52 carats in later scientific weighing, but already known in the trade as a singular thing, an object that can dominate a room without making a sound. To sell it, Cartier must do more than present it. He must construct a narrative strong enough to justify the price and seductive enough to make purchase feel inevitable. He must reset it in a way that fits American taste. He must write. He must visit. He must wait. He must let anticipation become part of the payment. An invoice is prepared. The figure attached to the stone is not casual. $180,000 is the widely repeated price for the deal in 1911, a sum that turns a piece of carbon into a public event. A purchase like that cannot remain private. It becomes gossip, then headline, then legend. The Hope diamond arrives in the McLean world as more than jewelry. It is proof of domination. It is also a test. The diamond carries stories from earlier owners, stories of bad luck, stories that are convenient for sellers because fear creates attention, and attention creates value. In Washington, where reputation is currency, a cursed stone is not only superstition, it is a theater prop. It invites people to talk about you. It keeps your name in circulation even when politics shifts. And other hostesses rise. Evalyn wears it. She shows it. She treats the curse stories as a joke, not because she is certain they are false, but because certainty is part of the performance she has chosen. A woman in her position is expected to appear untouchable. But the darkness of this chapter is not the superstition. It is the way a single object can become a container for everything a life is trying not to admit. A diamond is portable wealth, but also portable obligation. It must be insured, stored, watched. It must be accounted for during travel. It must be protected from theft, and protected from scandal, and protected from being sold in desperation, because selling it would be an admission that something has gone wrong. As the years advance, the stone becomes a fixed point in a moving, unstable life. It sits at the throat during parties. It appears in photographs. It becomes shorthand for the McLean's excess, a symbol that editors can use when they want to describe an era's appetite without writing the entire ledger of costs. The turning point is the moment the diamond stops being a purchase and becomes a brand. Once the Hope Diamond is associated with Evalyn Walsh McLean in the public imagination, she is no longer only a hostess. She is an owner of a legend. The stone begins to own part of her story. It ties her name to rumor, to fascination, to the kind of attention that is not easily controlled. And attention, unlike money, does not stay obedient. What remains today is the most literal artifact in this story. The Hope Diamond is on public display at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. It sits behind glass under controlled light. It is weighed, cataloged, labeled. It has become a museum object stripped of the private performances it once fueled. People file past it in a steady line, reading a wall text that reduces a century of obsession to a few paragraphs. What remains, too, is the paper trail that made it possible for the diamond to become legend in the first place. Purchase correspondence, insurance documents, estate inventories, the legal language that follows wealth like a shadow. In the end, the stone is not only a jewel, it is an entry in a record. The question is not whether a diamond can be cursed. The question is what a diamond teaches a person to ignore until the ignoring becomes impossible. Chapter 4. The Coroner's Form. May 1919, Northwest Washington, in front of the McLean Country Place. The paper is plain. It is meant to be. A printed form with blank spaces that force a life into categories: name, age, cause, time, location, witnesses. A child's name goes into the line where adults usually go. Vincent Walsh McLean is 9 years old. He is struck by an automobile and does not survive. The event is fast. The paperwork is slow. A doctor is summoned. A statement is taken, and an official record is made because the state requires a record, even when the family can afford to pretend that nothing required them. In a city built on rank, a coroner's form is one of the few documents that treats every household the same. In the McLean house, grief immediately becomes logistics. Telephone calls placed to relatives and clergy, a schedule cleared, trains canceled, florists given instructions, a funeral arranged with the quiet precision of a state visit, servants moving through corridors with their eyes down, carrying trays, receiving deliveries, counting chairs, counting guests, counting the hours until the first car arrives. Outside the house, the story becomes public because publicness is part of the McLean currency. Newspapers write what they can confirm: a boy, a car, a road, a family whose wealth has always been visible, now forced to display something else. The headlines do what headlines always do. They attach numbers to make the event legible. Age, inheritance, the scale of the household as a proxy for the scale of the loss. Inside, the loss is measured differently. A nursery that still contains objects meant to be outgrown, a set of shoes that will not wear down, a school schedule that will not restart, a staff member whose daily duties, lessons, supervision, outings have no target now, only habit. The Hope Diamond is still in the house. It is still cataloged in insurance riders, still placed in a safe when not worn, still handled by jewelers as a thing that must be counted and described in precise terms. But now the stone acquires a different kind of weight. The cursed stories that once served as entertainment become harder to dismiss because superstition is one of the mind's oldest tools for giving grief a shape. A family that believes itself protected by money is forced to confront a truth money cannot negotiate. The city's streets remain dangerous, and the body remains fragile. Evalyn does not turn this into a moral story in public. She continues to move through Washington society because withdrawal would invite a different kind of attention, and attention is already dangerous. But the tone changes. The entertaining becomes both more insistent and more desperate. The way some people keep lights on in a room to avoid noticing what the dark contains. Bills still arrive. Food deliveries, coal deliveries, wages, repairs. The household continues because it must. Grief does not cancel payroll. The turning point is not the funeral, which is formal and controlled. The turning point is the quiet period afterward, when the structure of the household reveals itself as a machine designed to keep going, even when the reason for going has been removed. What physically remains today is the part the city keeps for everyone, rich or not, the cemetery. Evalyn is later buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C., and the Walsh family tomb becomes a fixed point where the family's private grief is held in public stone. The cemetery itself remains a map of Washington's old hierarchies, names carved deep, dates arranged like ledgers, the long record of who belonged to the city's permanent story and who did not. And what remains in archives is the administrative residue of the event, death registration, inquest documentation, the kind of paperwork that survives because it is filed correctly and stored correctly. In a life built on display, the most durable record of the tragedy is a form designed to be routine. The question is not whether a family can survive loss. The question is what it spends, money, attention, denial, to keep the loss from changing the entire architecture of its life. Chapter 5. The Ransom Receipt. 1932, Washington, D.C., in an office where the blinds are kept half drawn. The paper on the desk is not elegant, it is not engraved. It is not intended to be framed or saved in a family album. It is a receipt. A sum is written down, a date, a promise implied. By the act of payment, the money is counted, placed into an envelope, and passed across a boundary that is not physical but moral, the boundary between what you can control and what you are only paying to feel you control. By the early 1930s, Evalyn McLean is no longer simply a hostess. With a famous necklace, she is a woman living inside accumulation of grief, of obligations, of rumors, of unpaid accounts that can be postponed but not dissolved. The marriage has been failing in plain sight. Edward Ned McLean's behavior grows more erratic as years pass. Drinking is not an evening habit, it becomes a governing force. Affairs stop being whispered and become structural, forming a second life that competes with the first. The Washington Post, an institution that once functioned as a disciplined machine of payroll, presses, circulation, and advertising, begins to wobble under mismanagement and personal chaos. Staff morale drops, business confidence thins. In an enterprise built on public trust, private disorder becomes financial disorder. Evalyn tries the methods she understands. She spends to maintain the surface. She entertains to keep influence alive. She buys to keep the story pointed toward glamour instead of toward debt. She continues to treat objects, jewels, parties, houses, as proof that the family remains intact, because Washington is a city that reads appearances as policy. But the country changes around her. The Depression makes lavishness look not merely indulgent but provocative. Credit tightens. The old informal arrangements that once allowed the wealthy to carry debt quietly become less forgiving. Banks become more cautious. Creditors become less polite. The same city that once praised magnificence begins to enjoy watching it strain. In this environment, a con artist does not need to invent greed. He needs only to present a situation where fear becomes more powerful than caution. The Lindbergh kidnapping becomes a national fixation. The crime is both intimate and public, the kind of event that makes people believe that no family is fully protected by fame or money. Into that atmosphere steps Gaston Means, a man with a talent for proximity and persuasion, claiming access to channels that are always just out of reach of ordinary law. He offers what the desperate always want, a private solution that will not require patience. Evalyn pays him. The amount advanced is large, reported in excess of $100,000, an immense sum even in her world, and a sum that shows how fear can turn money into a blunt instrument. The receipt is the symbol of this chapter because it captures the real shift in her life. She is no longer merely spending for pleasure, she is spending for control. A person like Evalyn has lived with the assumption that money can solve most problems if applied quickly enough and in the right place. That assumption works in social life. It fails in a world of criminals, publicity, and the federal state. Means disappears with the money. He resurfaces. He asks for more. The story becomes another layer of humiliation because it is the kind of scandal money cannot easily hush. It involves law enforcement, press attention, and the public's appetite for watching a famous woman be fooled. Here, Evalyn's instincts harden. Suspicion replaces the old, confident openness. She begins to cooperate with police efforts that lead to Means being pursued, charged, and ultimately convicted on larceny-related grounds. The process is not cinematic. It is procedural. Statements, warrants, court appearances, evidence presented as documents and testimony. The law does not resolve shame. It only resolves the case. The turning point is the moment she realizes that the world has changed its terms. Her name still opens certain doors, but it also attracts predators. Her money still buys access, but it also buys traps. Her public visibility, once useful, now amplifies every mistake. What physically remains today is not a jewel or a mansion in this chapter. It is the infrastructure of the federal city, the courthouse world of filings and prosecutions, the long paper trails created by criminal cases, the archives that keep records long after the gossip dies. And it remains in a quieter, more personal way, in the tightening of her life. Fewer people fully trusted, fewer transactions done without paperwork, more money routed through trustees and attorneys because informal confidence has become too expensive. The question is not whether a rich woman can be deceived. The question is what happens when she learns that her money is no longer protection, only bait. Chapter 6. The Bankruptcy Petition, June 1933, Washington, D.C. The Post's sale is a public event, but its true beginning is private, and it begins with a petition. Bankruptcy paperwork is designed to strip romance from ownership. It lists assets and liabilities. It reduces pride to numbers. It forces the owner to admit, on paper, what the city has already begun to suspect. The Washington Post, under Ned McLean's control, reaches the point where it can no longer carry itself. In an era when newspapers depend on advertising and public trust, a paper that looks unstable becomes unstable faster. Vendors hesitate. Advertisers pull back. Credit tightens. Payroll becomes a recurring crisis rather than a routine function. Then the legal process takes over. Receivership, sale terms, a formal transfer. The press keeps running because the city needs the paper's output, but the ownership changes hands through procedure rather than persuasion. For Evalyn, this is not only the loss of a business, it is the collapse of a pillar that had supported the entire performance of the household. The Post had been more than income. It had been a platform, a source of influence. a machine that made their name feel structural rather than merely ornamental. Once it is gone, the other parts of the life look different. The mansion becomes a cost center. The parties become evidence. The jewel boxes become both treasure and liability because jewels can be sold and everyone knows it. In the background, Evalyn attempts something that signals just how far the domestic chaos has traveled into institutional territory. She consults medical and legal authorities about Ned's mental condition, hoping to have him evaluated, declared incompetent, and committed. It is not a personal argument anymore. It is a formal attempt to place the disorder under guardianship, another way of saying to turn a failing husband into a managed asset so the wreckage stops spreading. This is a cold process. It is paperwork heavy. It involves doctors' reports, attorneys' motions, court permissions. It involves the state's willingness to decide that a man of a certain social standing has become unfit to control his own life. It also exposes the limits of Evalyn's own control. She can initiate procedures, but she cannot reverse time. She cannot restore the stability of an institution once creditors and courts have entered the room. After the sale, the family's life contracts even if the address remains large. The household adjusts. Staff is reduced. Some bills are paid later or restructured. Decisions that once would have been made casually, travel, entertaining, purchases, now require calculation. The act of choosing becomes an accounting exercise. The Hope diamond remains, but it has changed again in meaning. It is still a legendary object, but now it resembles something else, a locked reserve, a symbol that can be monetized, but that, if sold, would announce a defeat too clear to disguise. The turning point of this chapter is the moment the McLean story becomes irrevocably legal, not whispered, not negotiated socially, filed. Once the bankruptcy petition exists, it can be read. Once the sale is recorded, it cannot be undone by charm. Once a man's competence is questioned formally, the household's troubles become part of the public system. One more case moving through Washington's administrative corridors. What physically remains today is the evidence trail itself. Bankruptcy records, receivership documents, corporate filings, and the institutional paperwork surrounding the post's transfer survive in archives because the government preserves what it processes. The newspaper continues in new hands because institutions, unlike families, can survive by replacing leadership. And in the city's geography, the old sites of publishing, buildings that once held presses and offices, stand as reminders that power in Washington is not only elected, it is printed, financed, and administered. The names on the masthead may change. The machinery remains. The question is not whether a fortune can be spent. The question is how quickly a fortune can turn into a court file. Chapter 7. The Inventory List, mid-1930s, Washington, D.C., in a lawyer's office near the federal buildings. The room smells faintly of paper and glue, cardboard file boxes, twine, a steel cabinet with a key that turns slowly, as if it is reluctant to open. On the desk is an inventory list, not a poetic list, a strict one. Jewelry described by weight and setting, watches with serial numbers, silver counted by service pieces, furs described by length and condition, paintings measured in inches, furniture reduced to category and estimated value, properties named by address, not by memory. A clerk reads each item aloud, and a typist strikes the keys hard enough to make the words permanent. This is what it looks like when a life that relied on confidence begins to rely on documentation. After the sale of the newspaper, after the humiliation of criminal deception, the household is no longer protected by the old assumptions that the world will politely look away. Creditors no longer look away. Newspapers no longer look away. The legal system does not look away because it cannot. It must keep a record. Evalyn is still living inside. Large rooms, but the rooms have changed in function. They are no longer stages for effortless dominance. They are collateral. The mail arrives each morning with a consistency that is almost cruel. Notices, past due statements, requests for payment arrangements, letters from attorneys written in calm language that is meant to sound helpful even when it is threatening. A fortune can be vast and still be fragile if it is built on spending rather than on structure. Her marriage continues to deteriorate into procedure. There are doctors' evaluations, legal motions, attempts to put boundaries around a husband whose behavior has become impossible to contain. In wealthy families, domestic catastrophe often becomes institutional. Petitions, hearings, guardianship arrangements, and the quiet handover of decisions to professionals who charge by the hour and leave a paper trail behind them. The turning point of this chapter is the moment control stops being personal and becomes fiduciary. Once trustees and attorneys begin managing a life, the owner becomes, in practice, a subject of management. Decisions that once belonged to the person now belong to the file. The file has its own logic. It prefers preservation to pleasure. It prefers the liquidation that can be proven to the spending that must be trusted. And while the paperwork tightens around money, the family's private world tightens around loss. The son who died as a child remains the first break in the story, the one that cannot be rewritten. Then, as the years turn into the 1930s, more grief arrives. A daughter dies young. Later, another dies young as well. The public notices because the McLean name is still a headline, but the public cannot measure what those deaths do inside a house where rooms were designed for children to grow up into, where a family imagined itself as permanent. In those years, the Hope Diamond sits in its own kind of custody. It is insured. It is appraised. It is described again and again in official language, because official language is how institutions hold on to value. When it is moved, the movement is documented. When it is worn, the wearing is reported, photographed, and then folded back into the story of Evalyn as spectacle. But spectacle has become a trap. The more famous the object, the more it attracts pressure from every direction. Thieves, opportunists, creditors, journalists, who can turn a jewel into shorthand for decadence. The diamond remains a symbol of possession, but it also becomes a symbol of constraint. Because now, if she sells it, the sale becomes a confession. And if she keeps it, the keeping becomes a risk that must be constantly managed. A jewel can be an asset, but it is also a vulnerability. It is something the world believes can be taken. The household responds the way households under pressure always respond, with reduction. Staff quietly, cut. Less entertaining, fewer deliveries. A slower rhythm, not chosen but imposed by the need to keep the numbers from collapsing completely. Behind every visible adjustment are the invisible ones, bills paid late, agreements negotiated, the steady grind of compromise. The inventory list continues to grow. Once inventory begins, it rarely stops. It becomes a habit of defense. It prepares for the moment a court demands to know what exists, what is owed, what can be sold. It prepares for the possibility that a life will be unpacked and priced in a public way. The question is not whether a person can own great things. The question is who owns the decision when the great things become the only remaining leverage. What physically remains today from this phase is the document trail itself. Legal files, estate preparations begun early, business records, and the institutional memory of Washington's courts and clerks. The city is built to preserve paper. It keeps what passes through its hands. And in physical space, the mansion remains, still standing, still imposing, repurposed into another function. A building that once declared a family's permanence now serves a different permanence entirely. the continuity of the state and the diplomatic world that replaces private wealth when private wealth fails. Chapter 8. The Auction Catalog. Spring 1947, Washington, D.C. An auction catalog has a particular kind of cruelty. It is polite, it is factual, it turns a life into lots, lot numbers, descriptions, measurements, provenance when it helps the price, condition notes when it might hurt, estimates offered in ranges as if the value of memory can be bracketed like that. The paper is glossy enough to resist fingerprints. The photographs are sharp. The language is controlled. This is how belongings become merchandise. Evalyn dies in 1947. The formalities begin immediately. Death is never only a loss. It is a transfer of responsibility. Death certificates, funeral arrangements, probate filings, the appointment of executors, the opening of safes, the sealing of rooms, the counting of objects that were once handled casually and now must be handled as evidence. And then, for a household burdened by years of financial strain, the conversion begins. Jewelry is removed from boxes and examined under bright light. Stones are weighed, settings inspected, values calculated, insurance riders compared to current market realities. Items that once moved through parties now move through appraisal offices and bank vaults. The Hope diamond, in this stage, becomes what it always was beneath the myth, a transferable object with a price, and a legend attached that can be monetized if presented correctly. The turning point here is the moment the legend outlives the owner in a practical way. After her death, the diamond does not remain as a family emblem. It becomes part of the estate's resolution. It passes into the hands of dealers who understand how to convert story into value and how to move a famous object through legal channels without losing control of it. Later, in the next decade, the Hope diamond enters a different kind of permanence. It becomes a museum object in Washington, D.C., displayed behind glass, labeled and cataloged, stripped of private ownership and repurposed as public fascination. A jewel once used to hold a social position becomes an exhibit used to hold a line of visitors moving slowly, reading the same few paragraphs, absorbing the same blue light. The ownership becomes institutional. The legend becomes educational. The object becomes safer and, in a strange way, smaller. The catalog continues to do its work. Other objects disperse. Furniture that absorbed decades of footsteps leaves the house. Paintings move to new walls. Silver moves into other dining rooms. Clothing that once signaled a season becomes anonymous once separated from the person who wore it. The mansion, too, no longer belongs to the life that made it famous. Washington keeps the building but not the household, and the family, as a structure, ends the way many dynasties end. Not with one grand collapse, but with a series of administrative closures. A child buried too early, a marriage turned into legal procedure, a newspaper lost by court process, a fortune thinned by spending, predators, and time. 2 daughters gone young. Then the final conversion, when the remaining symbols are turned into payments and records. The auction catalog is not a moral judgment. It is the outcome of arithmetic. It shows what was left when glamour could no longer serve as a shield. It shows what survives when control is gone. Paper describing objects to strangers. The question is not whether the Hope diamond brought misfortune. The question is what misfortune reveals about a life built on possession. What physically remains today is clear and visitable. The Hope diamond remains on public display in Washington, D.C., held by a national institution, whose job is to preserve objects beyond the lifespan of any owner. The Walsh McLean mansion remains as a standing artifact of Gilded Age wealth, converted into a new public function. The graves remain in Washington, carved in stone with dates that read like entries in a ledger, and the archives remain. Court records, probate files, newspaper histories, documents that do not flatter but endure. Closing, the receipt stub. June 1958, Washington, D.C., a federal building with long corridors. A clerk opens a ledger with a practiced motion. The columns are narrow. The handwriting in them is disciplined. Dates, amounts, reference numbers. Transfers logged so precisely that the entries feel less like money and more like weather, an atmosphere of record-keeping that surrounds the city and keeps it functioning. On the counter, a document is stamped. The stamp lands with a soft, final sound. A receipt stub is torn from a booklet and handed over. The stub is small. It would be easy to lose. The clerk does not look up to see whether the recipient is satisfied. Satisfaction is not part of the process, only completion. In Washington, power is often imagined as speeches and votes. In reality, it is also this: the quiet permanence of paperwork that outlasts personalities. Evalyn Walsh McLean's story, when it is reduced to what survives, is not a rumor about a curse. It is a sequence of transactions that grew more desperate as control slipped. A mining fortune converted into stone. $6 million from a mine sale, translated into a 60-room mansion designed to turn money into legitimacy. A marriage license that merged one system of wealth with another. Publishing influence laid over extraction wealth, both now expected to perform in the capital's unforgiving social theater. Then the jeweler's invoice. A legendary object purchased for a figure so large it became a headline and a symbol. The Hope diamond, worn as proof that the household could always exceed the limits that constrained other people. The stone's blue fire functioning as a kind of public signature, a portable announcement that the McLean name was not only rich, but unafraid. After that, the story darkens in the way real lives darken. Not with theatrical villainy, but with relentless accumulation. A coroner's form for a child. A family learning in the most brutal administrative language that money does not negotiate with death. Funeral arrangements made with precision because precision is what the household knows how to do. A nursery turned into a room that must still be cleaned, even though it no longer has a purpose. Then the culture shifts. The country enters economic collapse. Credit becomes cautious. Extravagance becomes a provocation. Into that climate comes the predator who sells access in exchange for cash. A receipt is written for money paid in fear. The state steps in after the fact with warrants and court dates, but the payment cannot be unmade. The humiliation becomes part of the record. Then the bankruptcy petition. The post no longer held as a family engine, but as a failing machine. Receivership. Sale. The enterprise continuing, as institutions do, but under different hands. The loss not only of income, but of influence, an essential conversion in Washington, where influence is often more valuable than cash. Then the inventory list, the slow tightening of trustees and attorneys around decisions, appraisals replacing indulgence, staff reduced, rooms quieted, bills assessed not for convenience but for survival, objects described in language designed for liquidation, not for love. Then the auction catalog, a life broken down into lots, furniture, art, silver, jewels, each item given a number and a description and a place in a sale that does not remember the dinners or the laughter or the arguments that once filled the rooms. The household dissolving the way households often dissolve when money becomes paper and paper becomes law. And through all of this, the Hope diamond shifts from power to burden, from emblem to leverage, from performance to custody. When Evalyn dies in 1947, the legend does not die with her. It becomes easier to handle. It moves from a private throat to a public case, from a jewel box to a museum vault, from a hostess's display to a national institution's label. In the National Museum of Natural History, the diamond sits under controlled light. Visitors line up. They move forward at the pace set by the crowd. They look for a moment that feels personal, an encounter with history, with glamour, with superstition, and then they move on. The object remains, indifferent to the stories people attach to it. The mansion remains too, still heavy with its own message. The Walsh McLean house stands at an address that can still be found. It is no longer a private stage. It is an embassy, a building now devoted to the formal relationships of states rather than the informal relationships of wealth. The rooms that once served dinners now serve diplomatic routines. The architecture remains, but the purpose has changed. That change is one of the clearest truths of this story. Power is always seeking a new steward. The graves remain, names and dates carved into stone. The long inventory of a family's presence reduced to what can be cut into a surface and left to weather. The paper remains in boxes and archives. Court filings, probate documents, receivership records, appraisals, inventories. The administrative skeleton of a life that, in photographs, appears to be all velvet and light. And that is the final shape of the darkness here. Not a supernatural curse, a human one. The curse of believing that possession is the same as control. Because control requires more than wealth. It requires restraint. It requires systems that do not depend on mood. It requires relationships that do not rot under indulgence. It requires a world that forgives. Washington does not forgive. It records. If you return to the image of a counter and a ledger, the stamp landing, the receipt stub torn away, you can see how the city absorbs every private drama into public procedure. A family can throw the most brilliant parties in town, but it cannot throw a party that cancels a court file. It cannot host a dinner that erases a petition. It cannot place a diamond on a neck and make a child return, or make a husband sober, or make creditors patient. The question is not whether Evalyn Walsh McLean owned the Hope Diamond. The question is what owning it trained her to believe about what could never truly be owned. And what endures, in the end, is not the glamour that newspapers once loved to describe. What endures is the museum case, the embassy wall, the cemetery stone, the archive box, the ledger entry. A life that tried to hold the world with spectacle is finally held by records, quiet, permanent, and incapable of being charmed.